Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk. With me today is the editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author and game designer Jim Dunnigan. Also joining us is the associate editor of Strategy Page, columnist and author Austin Bay. Welcome, Austin and Jim. I thought we'd spend a little time talking about Ukraine, not the Ukraine, but we're going to talk about Ukraine. I guess some of the media.
They prefer without the article, yeah.
Right, yeah.
There's no article in Russian or Ukrainian.
But we're probably not going to focus on what most people think is the top news. We're going to focus in on the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. When did this all start, Jim?
5 years ago, 2014, Russia grabbed Crimea with a special operations, scam. Russia always wanted Ukraine back. They believe, with some justification, but they agreed to let it go. Khrushchev gave Crimea to Ukraine. Well, he was Ukrainian for one thing, but that's another matter. Simply as how should I put it? A attaboy, a gift, as it were. It simplified things because it was an extension of, the Ukrainian Republic, as they called it then and now. And the Russians felt that they were being cheated, and then Putin started this whole, let's rebuild the empire. Well, he never said it like that, but that's what he's basically looking for. And he declared all the former states, all the former parts of the Soviet Union to be the near abroad and under the Russian sphere of influence. And they disagreed. So he's had a hard time. In the East, in the Central Asia, where you have the five stands, the five new states created out of Russian Central Asia, they are leaning more towards China because they have mixed feelings about that. Because it's what do we do, business or pleasure? If they go with China, they annoy the Russians, which is always a great indoor sport in Central Asia. But China looks no different from Russia as far as the imperial ambitions go. But at the moment, even Russia depends on China because Russia's broke. China's economy is thriving despite, the problems they're having now and will have in the future. And the Russians are going in the opposite direction. The problem with Zelensky and his predecessor was this whole 2014 campaign against Ukraine by Russia was in reaction to the president before how should I put it, the Velvet Revolution, the Orange Revolution, whatever. There was an uprising in Ukraine and throughout a president who had been elected on the promise that he was going to be hard on Russia and lean towards the West. Well, this president got bribed royally, as it were, and the word got out that their man had been bought. And the people of Ukraine were justifiably angry about that. The Russians were too, because they figure, hey, you bought, you stay bought. And they, I guess, accurately realized that they bought the guy, but they didn't buy the country. So their man was out. He's now living in Moscow. And the Russians are trying to get Ukraine back. And they failed at that, much to their chagrin. While they grabbed Ukraine, and we described that in great detail in Strategy Page, and they're having a hard time holding on to it because the Crimeans don't particularly like Russians either. They quickly realized that the Ukrainians may have been annoying and et cetera, but the Russians are worse. They invaded the Donbass, which was how should I put it, a historically largely ethnic Russian area. But the majority of the Donbass residents, both Russian speakers and Ukrainians, didn't want the Russians in. And the Russian offensive, as it were, they basically organized local rebels who were on their payroll. They sent in Russian soldiers pretending to be Ukrainians, et cetera. They huffed and they puffed, and the Ukrainians fought them to a standstill. despite the corruption continuing to, weaken Ukraine. And they've basically stalemated there ever since. The Ukrainians have lost, well, about 10,000 people have been killed, most of them civilians, or at least half of them civilians. 3,000 Ukrainian soldiers have died, 72 or 75 so far this year, even though they've had a series of ceasefires, for the last few years, but the Russian forces keep violating them. They keep firing, and there are daily reports on how many times the Russians have fired. They fired the artillery, etc. And of course, they shut down that Malaysian airliner, which didn't go down well in Europe. The Europeans did a big and long investigation. They proved conclusively, time and time again, that it was the Ukrainians and the Russian rebels using Russian air defense equipment that shot it down. Because what they did was were able to get fragments of the missile, even though at first the Russian pro-Russian or the Russian subsidized rebels didn't let them in there, but eventually they did because there was a lot of heat coming from the world, and they basically examined the wreckage, and they deduced that the missile used was a missile the Ukrainians didn't have. The Ukrainians had that air defense system, that surface air missile system, but they didn't have the latest missiles that only the Russians had. So that was pretty much, the stake in the heart of the vampire. The Russians keep denying it, but the basic consensus in the rest of the world is it was the Russian guys who were basically allowed to do whatever the hell they wanted. Mainly, they were shooting down Ukrainian transports, and mostly transports, and that's why they fired at the airliner. They thought it was just another Ukrainian trick to, send in supplies or whatever. So the Russians are still taking a lot of heat on that. They cannot afford a war in the Ukraine because they have the war in Syria. As we've described this in great detail regularly in Strategy Page. They don't have the money. For example, in Syria, they had smart bombs. We always knew they had smart bombs. We didn't realize how small their arsenal was. I mean, it was pitiful. They ran out like in a month, and they had to start using, dumb bombs. Fortunately, nobody was firing back on the ground, or at least not much. And they did have a new, fire control system for manual bombing, which we have. Most Western countries, Western countries have the same thing, but they don't have to use it much anymore because we have plenty of smart bombs. But they had to use it, and so it was no big deal. But it was a big scandal. It was not a big scandal, but it was somewhat shocking to a lot of people that Russia had these Western-style weapons, but they simply couldn't afford to have enough of them to fight a sustained, battle. The Chinese took note of that as well, because the Chinese also have smart bombs, and they have a lot of them. And that the Russians are aware of that. So the Russians are basically caught in a web of their own devising, and they're trying to find a way out. They did put a lot more troops on the Ukrainian border, but as we described in Strategy Page, we keep a close track of what's going on in the Russian army. They're still highly dependent on conscripts who don't want to be there. They have this enormous draft dodging rate, which they really are afraid to crack down on because they still have a quasi-democracy. I mean, they cannot ignore the will of the people, shall we say, as much as the Soviets did. And of course, the Russians, especially Putin, realized that if you push the people, no matter how much you have them under control in a police state, they will eventually bring you down. So the Russians are also, looking over their shoulders at history and trying not to repeat what happened to the Soviet Union. So that gives the Ukrainians hope. The biggest thing the Ukrainians have going for them, or had going against them, was they still have the corruption. Their armed forces could be in a lot better shape, but they want to. They basically have to stop the hemorrhaging of all the money that's being lost because of the insider dealing, the outright theft, et cetera, et cetera. For example, what Trump was going on about with Biden. Biden had boasted, I mean, we have this on record, that he got a Ukrainian prosecutor who was investigating corruption to back off. Now, this was after the Ukrainians removed the pro-Russian guy. They got a bunch of new people in, but they were still corrupt. Not as corrupt as before, but you get the picture. Zelensky got elected on the platform that, hey, I'm not a professional politician. And hey, you've seen me in the TV show I produce and star in, where a comic gets accidentally elected president. Sound familiar? Anyway, so he and Trump have a lot in common, so to speak, in terms of what they're trying to do, what they're trying to accomplish. So in that phone call transcript, when Trump is talking about, taking care of the corruption, he's basically saying the same thing the United States has been saying since 2014, except before he got elected, we were saying it with our fingers crossed behind our backs. We didn't really mean it, because Biden then could basically say, hey, I got the Russians to back off on the Ukrainians to back off on this this corruption investigation, which he didn't say that it was closing in on his son, but that was basically what it came down to. The Democrats now consider that a impeachable offense, and I think that's all going to blow up in their faces. And I think Trump knew this. But the other problem is, making public the transcript of a confidential conversation with a foreign leader is a huge breach in international protocol. And you do that, and you make it not only difficult for the current president of the United States to conduct conversations over the phone with foreign leaders, but you do it for all future presidents. Who's going to believe the United States? That's why everybody's dancing around, exactly how they got this transcript. They went through all the folderol, and you're going to see some, backtracking on that. So, well, we didn't really mean to, basically violate the how should I put it, the constitutional right of the president to conduct, conversations with foreign leaders in pursuit of the, foreign policy of the United States, which belongs to the White House. But that aside, the current situation is Zelensky, no matter what our Congress says, is going to pursue the corruption. Now, the problem is, as he pointed out when he got elected, when he took power earlier this year, was that he's basically not that experienced. He admits it, but he says he knows how to hire smart people. And he already had lined up people who were basically generally accepted, shall we say, to be clean and competent, and he's putting them in charge. But he really can't clean the stable all at once. And the Biden investigation, or the investigation that involved, Biden's son, is basically far down on the list. He's got to go after things which are more important to Ukrainians. You can't blame him for that. But you can't blame Trump for saying, whatever, he was implying or whatever. He wanted that thing not to be forgotten because, he wants to basically make it clear to American politicians, present or future, that you do not want to basically say one thing about cracking down on corruption in foreign countries and then doing something else, offline, as it were. That is not anything new. I mean, that's been basically the foreign policy of the United States for decades. We've poured billions of dollars into foreign countries which are totally corrupt, and I found this out over the years. And I said, well, why do they keep doing it? And of course, the real reason is they basically want to have some degree of control, of influence, as it were, in a foreign country. And if it means a lot of the money is going to get stolen, well, that's the price you pay. Now, politicians can't sell that to the general public, but to other, diplomats and to people in the government, say, well, that's the best we can do. Trump, and that's what disturbs, a lot of his Democratic opponents, doesn't believe that you have to keep doing things the bad old way. There are better ways to do it, and he's inclined to try and make changes any way he can, and that's what he's doing. And of course, as a lot of people point out, he's basically doing what he's there for, and the Democrats are doing something else. But that's another matter. Zelensky doesn't really have a problem with Democrats controlling the parliament. He controls parliament. But even with that, and even with basically a blank check to go after corruption, there's only so much you can do, in the time, he has. So there we go. That's basically the problem with Trump and corruption in Ukraine.
Austin?
Dan, let me pick up on something about the corruption war. Normally Jim and I just shoot this off the top of our heads, but I knew that this was not off the top of our heads, writing what we do about troubles, armed conflicts around the world. But I pulled up just before we started recording a PDF that I've got on my computer of my book, Cocktails from Hell. And I want to read one section, just one. It's just one paragraph in the Ukrainian strategic assessment. Ukraine's internal corruption war. The Ukrainian government contends the invasion, meaning the Russian invasion of Ukraine in the late spring of 2014. Actually, it's February of 2014 when Russia invades Crimea, but then they start the Donbass war really about a month and a half, 2 months later. The Ukrainian government contends the invasion prevents it from effectively pursuing economic and political reform. Western creditors disagree. They have been disappointed with Ukraine's efforts to combat corruption. Now, I actually wrote that in January of 2018. And that disappointment was in the Obama administration. It's certainly in the Trump administration. Here, the United States has been supporting Ukraine for a number of reasons. For one thing is that Eastern European American allies, NATO allies, the Baltic states, Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, demand the defense of Ukraine because they say it's the defense of their own sovereignty against a reinvigorated Russia. Jim and I will talk a little bit more about that. There's some little debate back and forth, but it's the Empire Strikes Back was a joke that Jim made actually in the 1990s about Russia trying to revive after its severe Cold War loss. But the Ukrainian internal corruption issue, say that's a legacy of life in Eastern Europe, a legacy of communism, because the nomenclatura was utterly corrupt. It's there, it was pervasive, and if we send them money and it disappears, this was one of the reasons for hesitancy on the part of both the Obama administration and the Trump administration on supplying certainly advanced weapons, but something beyond food, ammunition supplies, and light weapons because of a concern that they would be used appropriately. Now, that said, Poland, it was another one of these great covert operations, was supplying Ukraine, the Ukrainian military, such as it was in terrible shape in 2014 when Russia invaded, with light infantry weapons, mortars, some artillery, and eventually they got better tactical communications equipment. Remember that now we're talking about something that occurred 5 years ago. But the corruption issue was huge, and that's one of the things Zelensky ran on. As Jim pointed out, that I'm going to mess his name up, Jim. Vladimir, is that? I mean, I heard it pronounced on the radio a couple of days. Vladimir Zelensky is Vladimir the way it's pronounced.
But yeah.
I thought it was. I really liked it.
Ukrainians pronounce them a little differently than Russians do.
Yeah, well, I'm doing it.
I mean, you call the capital Kyiv, not Kiev.
Yeah, I'm doing it in Texan. Okay, Vladimir Zelensky. The story on this guy is really rich because for one thing, he grew up in eastern Ukraine. I'm not sure where, but his parents were ethnic Russians, Jewish ethnic Russians. But he identifies as a Ukrainian. And when he was working on this TV show that Jim mentioned, where he plays a comic, and he's a comedy writer and a comic himself. The response to it was because this comedian, as I understand it in the plot, was standing up against corruption and bad guys, and he thought, wait a minute, why not give it a shot? He wins. There, as Jim pointed out, there are some interesting, let's call it media political similarities between Zelensky and Trump, both in their their presentation, public presentation of themselves, and also their rhetorical capabilities and their willingness to get into a verbal tit for tat. Okay. You have in Zelensky a figure that begins to not moves the ball forward to addressing that real strategic weakness in Ukraine, which is the corruption. And that's why I went and read that paragraph from Cocktails from Hell. Drop back to the late 1990s, early 2000s. I wrote I'd used this quip in the 1990s about the Rubik, that like of a Rubik's Cube. And it's cropped up in some of my Creator Syndicate columns. I started using it for sure 2003, 2004. Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan. That actually comes from something that Jim and I did for the second edition of A Quick and Dirty Guide to War, which we were writing before the Soviet Union fell apart. Those four countries are the basis of a superpower. And putting them back together, the part of that second edition speculated about if somebody wanted to rebuild the Soviet Union, well, what are the essential pieces? Well, there they were. And I made the joke that's like solving a puzzle. Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan. Early 2000, I think it's actually 2005, he's caught on tape saying this. Putin says the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. He's an old KGB colonel. He was born and bred and leaned on KGB nomenclatura and the Soviet Empire. So he begins, at least, and this is perceived by his target countries. Look at the 2008 Georgia War. That war tested some of the techniques that you saw, and we all saw in Crimea in February, March 2014, and then in the Donbass War, as it's called in eastern Ukraine. Special operations forces, so-called rebel militias, lots and lots of propaganda. In other words, narrative warfare. And Eastern European countries said, "Hey, look, the bear's back." And of course, at the same part and parcel of this was economic warfare. Russia turning on and off the natural gas and threatening to deny crude oil supplies. Also, what's going on? We've talked about this before too, and Poles were already aware of it. They were. I know from a reservoir engineer here in Texas, and yes, he's done oil and gas reservoir analysis, that the Poles in 2012, 2013 were already at least discussing with American industry what can be done if you all start producing more natural gas. We don't want to be vulnerable to Russian pressure. Now, that's just an anecdote, but you can see subsequently in 2014, the Poles are saying, look, we're going to build a liquefied natural gas port. In other words, for importing American liquefied natural gas. If you guys really start exporting it again, and fracking produces substantially more natural gas to the point that you are an exporter. We don't want to be bullied by Putin, by the Kremlin, and we want to be able to stand up to their expansionist bid. Now, February 2014, a refined version of the August 2008 Russo-Georgia War begins with the grab of Crimea. As Jim pointed out, Khrushchev gave it to Ukraine as a brotherly Marxist-socialist gesture. I forget the exact language, but you will see it quoted. And wait a minute, here's Crimea, which the Russians called their territory, but heck, it's all one big Soviet Union. So the Russians, here's Putin. There's 20,000 Russian sailors, naval infantry, and soldiers in Sevastopol because it's still a huge Russian naval base. They had a long-term lease on it. The Russia did, and Ukraine was fine with it. So they've already got over 2 divisions, if you look at it in ground combat terms, in Crimea. Plus what else they're able to introduce, and they took it. I told you earlier that Ukraine's military was in terrible shape. Putin, in March of 2014, promises that more is to come. 2014, and I discussed this as an indicator in that Russians' Wars of Expansion chapter in Cocktails from Hell. The Kremlin and Putin start talking about new Russia, meaning we're on the prowl again, and we're recovering ethnic Russians in ethnic Russian territory in eastern Ukraine. Heck, we might take all of Ukraine. That was being publicly bandied about in the summer of 2014. And the primary, Jim mentioned it, it's really 2 areas, Luhansk and Donetsk in eastern Ukraine that are heavily ethnic Russian. But in that early phases, late spring, summer of 2014, you actually had regular army Russian units in there, masked, trying to operate covertly, along with intelligence units, special operations forces. But the cover was local, quote unquote, Ukrainian militias that were standing up, ethnic Russian Ukrainian militias, standing up against Kiev. It was enough below the radar that the West wouldn't react. That was the Kremlin's theory, and the West was slow to react, even though as the Obama administration said towards the end of 2014, look at all the sanctions we put on. But then you'd already had 6 months of Russian slow war with the idea that we'll break Ukraine economically, and when the weak-kneed West fails Ukraine, we'll make the point that our will is superior. We're a new power again. They also, and I'll make this was an operational / tactical point. They kept aiming at a port that's on the Sea of Azov, Mariupol, and and there was a analysis. I think we even talked about it here on Strategy Talk, that the Russians were going to seize a corridor right along the northern edge of the Sea of Azov, so that they would have a land corridor going to Crimea. Note, Mariupol has not been, if I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, has still not been taken by pro-Russian forces. Instead, the Russians have built a big bridge across the Kerch Strait. Kerch is the way it is in English, connecting Russia to the Crimean Peninsula. Jim said this in his initial analysis. There has been very little movement since fall 2014 on the ground. And yet at the same time, there's an ongoing war of attrition. Last time I looked, which was maybe a week ago, there were reports of about 24 attacks in eastern Ukraine. Some of them quite serious, involving 122 millimeter artillery being fired by pro-Russian units on a Ukrainian-held position. So it's still a hot war, even though it's a slow war. Interestingly enough, Zelensky says the Russian foreign minister contacted him this week and said, we're interested in ending it. Well, that's interesting for a number of reasons, because Russia says this was a Ukrainian rebellion. It's an insurgency. Well, it's a Russian invasion that's failed. Has Ukraine turned the corner on corruption? Dan, I really don't know. I do know Zelensky he's different. And as Jim said, he's not part of the establishment. He's a true anti-establishment candidate. Has Ukraine turned the corner militarily? It's a better army. I'll leave that up to Jim, but there has been to comment on. But they've improved training. I know they've improved communications. They've also got combat experienced infantry now. And I'm talking about their special operations troops. There have been some of their quote unquote militia forces have seen extensive, steady, close combat for 4.5 years. And the fact that they've survived it indicates that they're good at what they're doing as soldiers. So that looks like that might be the case. Here's the leap forward. Is Ukraine ready to become part of NATO? No, I don't think so. But I'll tell you, that's something Russia must worry about. Russia used their war in Ukraine also as an attempt to rattle NATO. They've devoted, and we've covered this heavily for the last 6 years. The vilification of NATO has been going on for 80, 90 years, but I shouldn't, 80, 90 years, since the 1950s. Vilification of the West going on for 800 or 900 years, but by Russia. But they used this. The Kremlin tried to use it as an opportunity to rattle Eastern NATO nations, and all they did was scare them into becoming more harder core anti-Russians. So I think there's a strategic loss there on Russia's part, and it's time for Russia to cut its losses. I don't know that they're going to do it because Putin devoted a lot of political effort to stressing the fact that he was the new great Russian leader. So that's my take on Ukraine now.
Jim, so is the Ukrainian-Russian conflict about to pass into history?
Yeah, the Russians all have been angling, as it were, for a way out. You got to look at what's going on the Russian side of the Donbass, front. They've occupied about half of those two provinces that comprise Donbass, and inside those provinces, a lot of the civilians have moved to Ukraine. Some have gone to Russia, but most of them don't want to go to Russia because the word has gotten around that things are worse in Russia than they ever were in Ukraine. The reliability, or how should I put it, the fervor of the ethnic Russian rebels in Ukraine has declined. They've realized that all the promises Russia made were, smoke. Russia has not been able to, as Austin points out, the front line has not moved really. Well, actually, it has moved. This is an interesting development, which doesn't get much coverage in the news. The Ukrainians have been taking back territory.
Yeah.
Not a lot.
I should have
a village, a village here, a village there. And one reason they're getting away with that is because the local rebels who mainly do the area defense. They're the local defense crews. They don't want to defend. Areas that are basically controlled from Russia, even though Russians are pouring billions of dollars a year into sustaining the wrecked economy in their portion of the Donbass, and basically it's costing the Russians a lot of money. They can't afford to even try a major military push. If to do that, they'd have to use all Russian forces. The Ukrainians in the pro-Russian or the ethnic Russian, the pro-Russian people in Ukraine, in Donbass, are mostly ethnic Russians, and a lot of them really, polls before the 2014 indicated most of them, yeah, they were ethnic Russian, but they were Ukrainians. I mean, they considered themselves Ukrainians. They felt they were better off in Ukraine than they were, if they were back part of Russia. So that's something the Russians can't overcome. Zelensky, his problem with the corruption and his priorities have to do partly with the fighting in the Donbass, because there have been cases of corruption where the troops, especially those militias Austin was talking about, basically the volunteers, who are much more under control, military control, and on the Ukrainian side than they are on the Russian side. They found that they're promised certain quantity of supplies, and a lot of them don't show up. And the reason is, well, a lot of them initially said, well, some of them stole them, some bureaucrat. And then proof emerged that, yes, that's exactly what's happening. And that became a huge, how should I put it, public relations black eye for the candidate that Zelensky defeated. He said, look, you've had several presidents, since 2014, several leaders. And they almost to a man and woman in some cases, they've turned out to be corrupt. Says, try me. What do you got to lose? I have no dirt in my background. I made my way after independence. I got a sense of humor. I can laugh at myself. That's a big deal in Ukraine, and in Ukrainian politics at least. And so far, he's proven correct. He's basically hired technocrats, as it were, people who are generally known to be honest. He tells these new officials, senior officials, that you will be out on your butt real quick if you get dirty, even a little bit dirty. So coming in, you got to know that you're gonna have to live on your salary or on your savings, something like that. If so, you'll have to make sacrifices, for years during the Soviet period, as Austin pointed out, and after. A lot of politicians have said, oh, hey, we still got the racket going. We can still basically plunder as much as we can get away with. And we don't have to worry about some KGB pukes from Moscow coming down and spoiling our fun. But now they got Zelensky, a damn comedian. That's not funny for them. And the Ukrainians are eating it up. Now, he has to make progress. So reaching back to nail the corruption thing that involved, Biden's son, that's on the list, but it's way down the list. I mean, he's a politician now. He has to basically go after the large, low-hanging fruit that mostly impacts the Ukrainian people. The Biden thing, yeah, that was small potatoes in the big picture of Ukrainian corruption. The fact that it basically implicated a current presidential candidate and his son is embarrassing in the United States, but it was expected, before 2016, American officials coming into Ukraine, because they quickly found out that these guys were quite willing to play with the corrupt Ukrainian officials. And although the Americans were saying we have to stop the corruption, they took advantage of it when they had the opportunity, and some of them did. And again, Biden made a big mistake in publicly saying, I got this prosecutor to back off. He implied that basically the prosecutor was dirty and he was trying to basically interfere with American foreign aid. Well, that's not the case. And of course, this whole impeachment thing in the United States is going to bring that out. And so I wonder who had already figured that out. But anyway, not the people in Congress. And surprise. I mean, it's amazing what's going on in the United States, and I'm sure Zelensky and Trump had face-to-face discussions at the UN this week, having a chuckle over that. It would not be diplomatically prudent to get that into the American news. They're both laughing at the same things on both sides, on both countries. But that was the link they had. They were both outsiders. They were both fighting corruption. They were both fighting corrupt political systems, and so they had a lot in common. And so there's no way Zelensky's going to be forced to back off because he was elected not to back off. So look, I haven't been following. I try when we do our updates of Russia, which is upcoming in the next few weeks. I do check the Ukrainian media, and a lot of it's available in English. My Russian is rusty, but in a pinch I can translate something. They're basically, from what I did see before the current, contretemps, the Ukrainians thought, now we've got a Trump, so to speak, and they make all kinds of jokes on that. That hasn't hit the American news yet. It may never, at least not the mainstream news. But there's a lot of commonality. But the thing that Zelensky has to concentrate on first is corruption that affects the troops fighting or taking casualties, holding that line with the Russians, and of course the special operations guys who are mostly active in basically taking back a village here, a village there, and what bothers the Russians about that? I mean, they're not going to, so to speak, go to war over losing a village here, a village there every month or so. But the fact that they have not got any Ukrainians on their side who are willing to fight this take back. I mean, there have been cases where when the Ukrainian troops take over, you see guys in uniform coming out, taking the uniforms off and saying, all right, that's about time you guys got here, and joining the Ukrainian army. And they're Ukrainians, not Russian special operations troops, inserting more spies into Ukraine. They've got plenty of those. So Russia is losing, and they have been losing. I mean, as Austin points out, the line is not moved because the Russians learned they couldn't even take Mariupol. Now they're trying to take it indirectly by breaking international law with their Kerch Bridge and insisting that they control, seagoing traffic. Mariupol is not the largest port in Ukraine. That's Odessa. But Mariupol is the largest port in eastern Ukraine. And it basically brings in a lot of seaborne goods, whether they be from western Ukraine or from around the world. They come in through Mariupol. And because of the Russian semi-blockade under the aegis of they can have this new bridge, vastly illegal. But the Russians are taking, they're burning up a lot of diplomatic capital, trying to defend that. They basically have cut the traffic, the seagoing traffic into Mariupol, and that's hurting Ukraine economically. Now the Ukrainians know who to blame. The rest of the world knows who to blame, and the Russians don't want to take that kind of heat. They eventually have to give in, or they're simply going to be bled to death. And the Russians have not got a lot more blood to give. If they're given a choice between Ukraine and Syria, they take Syria. Well, that's a lost cause as well, economically speaking. But they are allowing Russian firms to invest in Syria, which is even more dangerous than Africa, where they're making a lot of investments. But anyway, the problem is the Russians are losing. They don't want to admit it. And this current impeachment nonsense about how the president conducts foreign affairs has got long-term implications for the American ability for any American president in the future to conduct foreign affairs, and that basically gets down to the fundamental well-being of the United States. That will eventually come up. And I think it will be forced to come up because of the impeachment, going forward with the impeachment. So, you got to ask yourself who's playing 3D chess and who's playing checkers in that game. But as far as, the corruption goes, Zelensky and Trump are on the same page, just not to the same chapter.
Right. And
Dan, let me make
ooh, okay,
point.
Quickly, we're out of time.
They taking back a few villages by the Ukrainians. They're slow offensive on this. They're giving the Russians a taste of what they kept doing after the Minsk peace agreement, the initial one in the fall of 2014. The Russians just outright violated it, and now they're getting the favor returned to them. One other thing too, this is a strategic political defeat for the Kremlin. Anytime you see Sweden and Finland openly discussing joining NATO and the popularity of it, that tells you something, and it's told the Kremlin something. We've overplayed our hand, and maybe it sounds like it's back in the distance, but the Finns and the Swedes have made that clear that there is a substantial plurality of both of their electorates that think it's a good idea to join NATO. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Well, it'll be interesting to see when people start pulling on all these threads, what's at the end of them, and it's going to be an interesting ride to watch both what happens in the United States and in Ukraine. We'll talk to you both next time.
Indeed. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.